right, real good?
Yep, so.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out today. We started already talking about the field school partnership that we've had here with UA and the Prewitt Cemetery Association, going on a little bit more than a year now, and really intensively did this work with them last fall, but continued some this fall. But before we get started, I want to introduce my co-presenters today. We have Patricia Kemp, who's the president of the Prewitt Cemetery Association, and we have Claiborne C, who many of you probably know, one of our PhD candidates. And yeah, we're going to be going back and forth, and I'm taking turns with our presentation today. So I'm just going to give a very sort of brief introduction to how this whole sort of project, this partnership came about. So as many of you, that's what we're going to do. So as many of you are certainly aware, archaeological field schools are a big part of our program here at the University of Alabama in the Anthropology department. And you see here that this page is from our article by Professor Emeritus Jim Knight, where he sort of laid out the history of archaeological field schools, 1956 to 2012. There hasn't been one absolutely every year, but almost every year, and many years more than one field school. And in this article, he sort of lays out, the different projects that have taken place, where they've taken place, and of course, the most of these took place at Mountville, which the university owns. And this article goes up to 2012. I got to UA in 2015, and then beginning in 2017, I was asked if I wanted to start doing the fall field school. And so 2017 through 2020, I taught a series of 4 field schools working at the Northeast Riverbank at Mountville. It has a lot of erosion going on. If you walk down there, there's a lot of rock that's been dumped there to stabilize the riverbank. This is the 2017 field school crew working out there. So I was asked to do the field school. Did this for 4 years. And then sort of roughly coinciding with the pandemic, around early 2020, mid 2020, the situation with Moundville, NAGPRA, repatriation, research there, sort of exploded in interest. Here, there's a couple of headlines from articles in the news. And so right now the university is in the process of repatriating the human remains and associated funerary objects from Moundville. As sort of with this background context, we sort of began a process of thinking through how we wanted field schools at Moundville to go forward. And so since then, I've been having lots of conversations with the tribes and trying to think about what a collaborative field school at Moundville or here in the Black Warrior Valley might look like. What would that mean? But that's a long, slow, hard process to figure out something like that, particularly with this as sort of the background context. So as I'm sort of thinking about what could a field school at Moundville look like going forward, I was also searching for alternatives in 2022. What could we do as a different kind of field school? Something not Moundville while we're working through these issues. And as I was sort of thinking about what might be an interesting, exciting thing to do, I got an email. I think Patricia emailed a number of folks here at UA with this picture, saying that she was working at the Prewitt Slave Cemetery in Northport, and she'd come across this item and was wondering if anybody could identify it. And I had no clue what it was, but I was really interested in what she was doing at the Prewitt Cemetery, and so I gave her a call, and we started chatting, and she mentioned she was interested in identifying the marked and unmarked graves at the cemetery. And I said, well, I do a lot of shallow geophysics. I teach an annual field school. I'd love to bring my students out here and help you out. It could be a great opportunity to train students and work with your organization. And we decided it'd be a great idea. So I'm going to turn it over to Patricia now to sort of talk a little bit about what she's doing, her project, the association, the cemetery.
Hi again, everybody. How's it going? How's school? You getting A's or B's or C's or D's? So somebody's out there getting some of all of that. Okay, so just do the next one over.
Yeah, you
just
there or just there.
Okay, all right. Okay, so everybody knows I'm Pat Kemp. I'm the president of the Prewitt Slave Cemetery Association. So basically, back in January of 2022, well, let me just go back real quick and tell you a little bit about how I know about the cemetery. I am from Northport, Alabama. I grew up here in Tuscaloosa, Northport area. My family, actually, I have family that are buried in the cemetery. My great grandmother and my great grandfather were enslaved people. So they are buried in the slave cemetery. So over the year growing up, I knew about the cemetery because, of course, my father would take me there, and we would see the cemetery, and the family, all of the descendants through the years would clean up the cemetery. So that's how I got connected to the cemetery. Okay. So once I retired in 2016. I decided that I want to give back. So I had a list of things I wanted to do, and one of them was to come back home and work on the cemetery. So in 2022, I decided that I was going to create a team to help me out with that. So then I realized I needed more than a team. So I then decided that I was going to make it a nonprofit. So I made it a nonprofit, decided that I was going to call it the Prewitt Slave Cemetery Association, and pretty much created these goals here. Basically, our goal is to honor all of the members of our ancestors and ensure that we were taking care of their resting place. That was really the goal, the overall arching goal. And inside that goal, I had some initiatives, actually some objectives. Though, as you see there, those are the objectives. I'm just gonna talk about one of them really quick, and that's the 3-phased project plan or statement of work. And that's really how I'm managing the whole project, is with that 3-phase plan. So we're going to talk about that, okay? Now, how did the cemetery get started? The cemetery was established by a slave owner. He was a plantation owner, slave trader, and one of the biggest one in Tuscaloosa. He also owned a slave ship. And he had a ship that would go down the Blackwater River down to Mobile. And that's where he would pick up the slaves and bring them back to Tuscaloosa. And he actually traded them in downtown Tuscaloosa. And also other slave traders also worked along with him to do this whole slave trading process. Now, John Welch Prewitt established the cemetery in 1824, actually November of 1824. When he established the cemetery is actually located, you guys know about the whole area of Tuscaloosa. Are you a little bit familiar with it? Do you know Highway 43 and 69, whatever? Okay, it's actually up Highway 43, and I'll have a map, probably, I think it's on the next page, okay? I do have a little bit of laryngitis that comes and goes, so if it goes, I'm going to keep talking, and I hope you can understand me. You'll just see this, okay? But I have the kind of laryngitis that comes and goes. It'll come, and then all of a sudden, you won't hear it anymore. But anyway, John Welch Prewitt supposedly had approximately 600 or more slaves. So with that, he decided that he needed a place for his slaves to be buried in. So he established a cemetery and it's a cemetery that's specifically for his slaves on his property. And he owned a little bit over 6,000 acres of land in that area. And that's basically where the cemetery is located. Now, the location is up Highway 43. Any of you know about Bull Slough Road? No? Okay, up Highway 43 to Bull Slough Road, and then you go on Bull Slough Road a couple of miles, and then off onto Old Byler Road. Now, Why is Old Byler Road important? Old Byler Road was the first road that was created in Tuscaloosa County. And the cemetery and Old Byler Road was built by the slaves. So that's why they're connected, okay? Now, that's the map. That's how you would get to the cemetery. And this is just a quick map. It really sits right off of Lake Tuscaloosa. If you're in the cemetery, the lake is right around the back part of the cemetery. So it's very pretty. You're in the cemetery and you see nothing but the lake in the back. And so it is 1.97 acres, but if you see anything published, they normally just round it off to 2 acres. So you'll probably see it published as 2 acres. Okay, so that's pretty much about where the cemetery is located. Okay, now the last burial, because I know a lot of people ask this question, it is an inactive cemetery. There are no burials there. There haven't been any burials since 1959. And John Henry Jones was the last person that was buried there. Now the cemetery has been cleaned up over the years since it was established in 1824. As I said earlier, the descendants and the family members would go in and clean it up periodically. So it was cleaned up by the family until I think around, I want to say it was 1985 or 86. And then there was a little period where there was no cleaning because the family members couldn't get together. And then they started to clean it up again. And then it stopped because trying to get family members to clean it up, you probably know what that's probably can sense what that's like. So when I started the effort, the cemetery had not been cleaned up in 20 years. So it was all grown up. And I'm going to show you some pictures to let you see what it looked like then and since I started working at it. Okay? All right. Now, this is going to give you, and I have about eight probably slides on this, the different types of actual stones or markers that are on the graves. And there are several different, and you probably know this, but there are different kinds of markers that were put on graves during that time frame. And so I'm going to run through really quick because I have a few more things to cover. And I know I got some people, I got my buddies here who has some stuff they want to talk to you about too. Okay, so I'm going to run through real quick. If I'm going too fast, say, wait a minute, I want to see that one again. Okay, so just really quick. These are what would be considered hand-cut river rocks and etchings that you would find as a marker for a gravestone. And if I hone in really close on this one, you may be able to see it, but that's a heart. That's a heart with the name of the person, and it has the date that the person actually was born and passed away. And that was actually done by one of the slaves. So you'll see that they did their own markings, their carvings, and they would carve names into it, and they would do different markings on them. The next one is a solid slab. Now, a lot of the markers that they used came from the river. They would go down to the river and they would actually get the slabs and different rocks or whatever from the river. So this is one that would be considered a type of a solid slab. This is one that's an arch. And this would be one that was probably in the later days, not around the 1820s, but later on in the time frame. And this, I know that today when we bury people, we usually don't put a footstone there. But back during that day, they would do a headstone and a footstone so that you would know where the head and the foot is. So this is just one that has a headstone and a footstone. Okay. These are some more flat rocks, and you can see how they would carve the names and everything into the rocks. Now this one over here, if you look really closely, and I hope you can see it. Can you see that right there? That's an actual stone that has grown into a tree. Now, what do those look like to you? Do they look like markers? Well, they are. These are called tent graves or comb graves, like you comb your hair. And basically what they were in that time frame, they were kind of like, there are a lot of reasons for them, and I've looked at the history of them, and someone would say that they put them there for protection, to protect the graves so that animals couldn't get to them. They put them there for a real marker so that they could see where the entire grave was. So there were different reasons that I have come up on as to why they use that. But these are actually an actual gravestone marker, and these cover the whole entire grave. Interesting, huh? And as a matter of fact, the Prewitt Slave Cemetery at one point in time had approximately 40 of those. And over the years, people had come into the cemetery and taken them out, using them for different purposes. So you'll see some of them were broken up or whatever, but they have been displaced over the years. Of course, the weather and animals or whatever also has caused some of them to not to be there today. Okay, so these are just an example of some of the most recent ones and how they personalize them. Okay, let's talk about the 3 phases, because this is where the professor comes in, and he's in my phase too. Okay, so I had 3 phases for the program, for the project, for the actual statement of work. And the very first phase was to clean up the trees, get rid of all the vegetation, do the survey of the land to make sure that I knew where the cemetery was versus someone else's property. So that was my very first thing that I wanted to do. Then the second thing that I wanted to do was to perform my geophysical surveys and also clean the headstones. And I added one just recently. I added 2 basically. And there are security issues that I was going to do in phase 3, but I think I need to do them in phase 2. And that is to fill in the holes in the cemetery. Because if you're out there now, some of the holes that are there are from, say, animals or trees being pulled up, and I need to fill those in so it's safer. And let's see. So the geophysical piece is when the professor and I got together, he then decided that he was going to come out and actually do the surveys for me. So he came out in the fall of 2022 with a class, the fall class, and they performed the actually geophysical surveys. And Mr. C is going to cover all that for you. Okay. And then in this year, I had the class out, the fall class out, who did some follow-on work, and they actually came out, and what had happened was some of the actual flags that they had put out in the earlier class to identify where the actual graves were, I needed to refine that. And so the class this year came out to refine that, redo the flags, make sure they were in the proper place, because I wanted to put down crosses. Okay. All right, so this is pretty much kind of a summary of that. The removal of the clearing of the cemetery was up until August. The professor came out in September of 22 with his first class, and that's when he did the geophysical. And then I had the land survey done in 22. It's just kind of a little summary. But the important bullet on this chart is I have some pictures for you. I have some befores, so you can see what the cemetery looked like before. And then I have that same location, so you can see what that location looked like afterwards. And then I have a few pictures to show you what it looks like today. Stop me if you want to see one longer, okay? So that's the site before I started cleaning that particular site. And that's what it looked like after I finished cleaning it. So the B would be before, the A is after, okay? I think I did a little work. Yeah. See any difference? Just a little bit. Okay, and this is what it looks like today. So after the professor came in and gave me the actual locations by putting in the flags after he did the surveys. I then came behind him and I put in crosses everywhere there was a flag, which indicated that there was a barrel above ground or below ground. So I've actually put a cross in to identify where a barrel was actually identified by his flags. So these are some pictures of what it looks like today. Okay, so now we're in phase 2. That's the phase we're in right now. So phase 2 again would be the geophysical, cleaning the headstones, and then putting, the 2 that I added, which was filling the holes and making sure that the leaves are not there for safety. Okay, so now I have some significant events that are going to go on in this phase as well. Last fall, I found out that Congressman Terry Sewell was interested in the cemetery because Congress has an effort that was going on where they wanted to approve some funds for just what I'm working on, which was the cemeteries for enslaved people. Okay, so she said, hey, I want to go down and visit that cemetery because that's part of one of the initiatives that Congress is working on now to try to get some money approved for. So she hadn't had a chance to get in touch with me, so I got in touch with her and I invited her down and she put me on the schedule, but she hadn't come to visit me yet. So I still have it as a planned visit. Okay, now one other thing has happened just recently, and that was the Alabama Tourism Department and the Old Byler Road Committee decided that they were going to work on making Old Byler Road more accessible to people and get the word out to as much as they could and make it part of the tourism sort of effort. And so in October of last year, they had a meeting and they made an announcement that they were going to fund Old Byler Road and improve it from the beginning of it to the end. Now, Old Byler Road starts in Tennessee. So they're going to have that whole, and it, as you know, it comes in and then it goes out and then it comes in, but you can follow the route if you really wanted to. And it goes all the way into Northport and from Tennessee. So what they plan to do is to spend some time and money and efforts on trying to improve that whole Old Byler Road corridor. But it just so happens that the Prewitt Slave Cemetery is the only national site, historical site, that is on Old Byler Road. So that makes Old Byler Road and the cemetery again connected, and that makes the cemetery extremely important now. And now the tourist department, along with the committee, are interested in the Prewitt Slave Cemetery because it is now on their route. So that's why that an announcement was made to include the Prewitt Slave Cemetery in the effort. Okay, and the very last thing there is I need money. So to get money, I'm putting in a grant, which is, I think the deadline, I believe, is March the 30th. And the professor is going to also help me with submitting some paperwork for the grant. So I hope to get some funding. Keep my fingers crossed. You guys cross your fingers for me. Okay, now phase 3 is my very last phase. And that's the one that I will be moving into hopefully before the end of the year. Because I was supposed to start it in 23, which I did. I'm working on some of these things. Actually, I've gone out and gotten my estimates for the fence. I've gotten estimates for the storage shed and all that kind of thing. But I'm not really moving into that phase until I have some funding. So that's my very last phase, and that's where I am today. I'm getting ready to move into phase 3 and hopefully get some money so that I can do my very last items, which would be my security, which is the fence, and making sure that there's safety which is filling in all the holes and all of the other peripheral items, such as the shed and so forth and so on. Okay, all right.
So when I met Patricia in the summer of 2022, she was just wrapping up, phase one of her project, which was clearing the cemetery, all of that brush and overgrowth, and made it actually a beautiful place for doing geophysics. Wide open, easy to get the equipment in there. So I was really excited about the possibility of coming to help her out. And it's a really interesting project because, if you look at old newspaper articles and discussions of the Prewitt Cemetery, there's wildly different estimates for how many people were actually buried there. Most of them range from 200 to 300 is the estimate, but there's never been a complete survey of all of the stone markers, and of course there should have been many unmarked graves there. So we were really excited about the possibility of doing a field school. So this is the 2022 field school. There's Claiborne. He was the GTA for that project. And then we did a little bit of work there. This field school, this is the 2023 field school, and Austin was the GTA that year. And this is where we were going back and replacing flags and putting flags in the locations of all of the unmarked graves that we had identified. So this is sort of an unusual field school in that there was no excavation. Typically when you think of an archaeological field school, you think digging. But, this is actually sort of a great field school, lots of archaeological skills that students were able to learn. We did surface pedestrian survey, really foundational method in archaeology, feature and artifact documentation, shallow geophysical survey, and then also teaching students, introducing them to collaborative archaeology, where we get to work with a community organization and be involved in a project that that really means something to the community. So it was really a great opportunity. I was really excited to do this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the survey, the pedestrian survey, and the documentation, and I'm going to turn it over to Claiborne to talk about the geophysical work that we did there. So you can see here, here are the field school students in 2022. Standard surface pedestrian survey. We lined everybody up and very slowly and carefully walked across the cemetery, flagging everything that we saw, every stone. Whether or not it was perhaps just a natural rock outcrop or an actual headstone or footstone, we flagged everything. After completing this documentation, here's you can see all the pink flags. There's just a sea of flags laid out across this 2-acre area. And then we went back and we documented. One, we used an RTK GPS system to get centimeter level accuracy, centimeter level locations reported for every single object that we identified in the cemetery. In addition to documenting the location, the students went to every single one of these flags. We gave a number to each object. They photographs of the objects here, and we completed a historic cemetery object form from the Alabama Historic Commission for every single one of these objects that we documented. And so after this systematic survey, this documentation of all of the above ground markers, we then turn to the geophysical portion of the project. And here's the map of all of the above ground markers, all of the stones that we found, and the location of each, coded here by whether they were a footstone, a field stone, a formal headstone, or one of those home graves that Patricia showed us earlier. And this is these squares. These are 20 meter by 20 meter squares, and these are the geophysical grids that we use for our surveys. So now I'm going to turn it over to Claiborne to talk about the actual geophysical work.
Okay, so obviously it's already been discussed a little bit, but the primary objective for doing geophysics at the cemetery was to identify any marked or unmarked graves at the cemetery. But in addition to that, the cemetery was sort of unique in that it could help from a geophysical perspective, sort of further develop cemetery methods using geophysics, or geophysical methods using cemeteries as case studies. And what I mean by that is that for the last, I don't know, maybe 30 to 40 years, geophysics have been used in cemeteries to varying degrees to identify and mark graves. But sort of in the last maybe 20 years or so, the methodologies that have been used in terms of geophysics has been kind of constricted. And a lot of that is related to sort of the use of this method and the use of cemetery surveys in private sector archaeology rather than academic archaeology. And so most folks are just using geophysics, the most efficient methods and things like that, and the most effective methods. So what you find is that some geophysical methods in archaeology, and particularly cemeteries, are sort of underutilized and underdeveloped. And so we don't really know what a lot of these can bring to the table when it comes to studying cemeteries. And so at the Prewitt Slave Cemetery, because it was so open and because we weren't working with any monetary or time constraints or anything like that, and we had the instruments available to us, we were able to utilize 4 methods for geophysical survey, and those were electromagnetic induction, ground penetrating radar, magnetic gradiometry, and electrical resistivity. And of those, the ground penetrating radar is the most commonly used in archaeological capacities for cemetery surveys, and also more so in Europe than in North America, but magnetic radiometry is used. Particularly because of the longevity and use of steel caskets and things like that in Europe and in Britain particularly. So again, at this cemetery, we used all 4 methods just to sort of see what they could identify. And so this is the electrical resistivity data. So across all of these 20 by 20 meter squares, we collected data in transects, so going back and forth across these. And for the electrical resistivity data, we did that every 50 centimeters, or roughly 25 inches. So over the 2 acres, we're collecting data every 25 inches across the whole cemetery. And what this methodology shows is that there are areas of very, very low resistance. Again, this is electrical resistivity, so we're measuring how compact the ground is and things like that. So really for electrical resistivity, what you're really looking for is disturbance of soil, so loose soils. And what we find is that there are areas, like these areas here that are darker, so these are low resistive areas, and they correspond to areas of pretty dense headstones going across and even unmarked areas going across the cemetery. So what we can say with this method here is that, soils are less resistive, meaning that there's higher concentrations of unmarked burials or marked burials in these areas because sometimes in geophysics, you may not have as many headstones as what we have at the Prewitt Slave Cemetery. And so this can be a methodology for sort of delineating where burials could potentially be, or boundaries of cemeteries and interments. So this is the magnetic gradiometry data. And so just generally magnetic gradiometry, it identifies or measures what we call magnetic susceptibility. And magnetic susceptibility is basically how when a magnetic force is applied to a piece of metal, how magnetized can it be? And so we look at the soils for this, and you can see there are a lot of these like very bright white, and then you have the black sort of corresponding areas like there too. So basically what that means is that there's pieces of metal in the ground. And so if you think about metals as magnets, you know, metals have a north and a south pole, right? So the black dots are the north pole of a piece of metal, and the white is the south pole of the piece of metal. And so you can identify pieces of buried metals, but you can also, in this capacity, identify potential grave shafts and things like that. As a particular spot has been disturbed and then filled back in. Most people don't realize this, but all the soils around the world have microscopic magnetic bacteria that sort of just exist. And so when you have huge accumulations of those things from disturbance and refilling of topsoil and things like that, you can identify areas such as, particularly in this case, these right here are very, you can see there's like little bitty darker rectangles kind of coming off of those. And so those are interpreted to be grave shafts in this case. So this is the electromagnetic survey. And so electromagnetic induction, it measures a couple of things: ground conductivity, and it also measures how magnetically susceptible a soil or an object is. But it does it in a little bit of a different way, and I'm not going to get into that theory. But so you can see in this image here, it's a lot less noisy than the magnetic radiometry data. So this is all metal up in here. And so this is also looking at the metal, but there are these little bitty dots instead of just it being blown out everywhere. And so what we can look at in this data set really is, what are the distributions of the metal, and do they seem like they correspond to areas where we think potential burial hardware from caskets and things like that could have been, some pine boxes. A lot of times in cemeteries, if a person was interred in a casket, it's no longer there. And so because it rots away, particularly at this cemetery, it's probably the case because the soil is very sandy, which is very acidic, and carbon doesn't exist very well in acidic soils, but also because it's tropical down here. And so we know from a lot of archaeological testing and radiocarbon dating and things like that, that wood and other perishable objects don't really maintain themselves very well in that kind of environment. So you can see in this data set as well that there are some areas here where there are metals and things like that cluster right there. And so we can say through this data set that while everyone may not have been interred in a casket, which is actually pretty common in historic cemeteries, that a lot of folks weren't buried in any kind of pine box or anything like that. That there were people buried in more formal caskets and things like that, but it's since decayed, and what's left is the nails and things like that. Or any sort of other metal objects that could have been buried with a person. And then the final method that we used here, which is the most common across all the different methods, is ground penetrating radar. And the reason why people use this one more than anything is because you can get a depth of how deep an object is, but you can also see, it's kind of like a 3D method. You can get a depth, but you can also get a horizontal picture of what the subsurface looks like at very discrete intervals. And so I think this image is looking at 50 centimeters below the surface. And so basically you can see sort of some of these darker dots are basically reflections from subsurface objects. And it really takes looking at so there's two ways to look at this data. You can see here, this is the vertical, what we're seeing in the vertical. So you get depth based on this, and then you correspond that with what you're seeing in the horizontal. And so here you can see these big reflections there. So those are traditionally, like whenever you're looking at radar data, the radar is reflecting off objects in the ground and bouncing back to the surface. But what you have in this data set is pretty much the radar wave reflecting off of top of the skull. And that's typical what you find in radar. So you're not imaging. So if you like think about like TV shows like Bones and CSI, whenever they use radar, they're looking at skeletons, which isn't reality. So, so you're really looking at just slight reflections off of human remains, yes, but it's primarily the skull that you get a reflection off of. And so if you look at some of this stuff here, like you'll have like these little bitty dots. So you won't have like elongated burials in a lot of these. And so those little bitty dots, black dots, that correspond to the reflections from the skull. In radar data, you can, in cemeteries, get evidence of grave shafts. So when people would dig the burial down, you can see, like this one here is a good example. This doesn't occur at the cemetery very often, but you can see there's a little bitty trail that kind of goes down on one side of it, and it kind of comes up on the other side. And that's indicative of a grave shaft. So when they were digging in to inter the person. And so sort of a just kind of like a little tidbit about doing it in cemeteries. A lot of folks think that historically, as they are today, folks were buried 6 feet like every time. But what we really find with radar data and working in cemeteries all across the United States with different case studies and things like that, people are really buried more like between 2 and 4 feet. And, you know, that's prior to mechanization of digging grave shafts and things like that. So I think at this cemetery, though, some of the later graves were deeper and some of the earlier graves were more shallow. And so they really range between, I don't know, I would say like 20 inches down to about 4.5 to 5 feet. And so basically bringing all of the geophysical methodologies together, we can sort of plot where each individual grave is out here. And so this is what the results of all the different methodologies yielded. We saw some graves and some methods that we didn't see in others. And so that's kind of, again, pointing to the validity of using multiple methods in cemeteries, which was what we were trying to do to see if we could identify anything else that one method didn't perform over another. And there was something else that I was gonna add to that. I don't remember what it is now. Let's see. Okay, so there's that. And then, what I was gonna say is that, you know, geophysical, adding on to not seeing every burial in one or more methods, you know, geophysics isn't a silver bullet for identifying everything, right? Like it's not going to work 100% of the time, every time. And so what we really found here is that about 51 to 52% of the marked graves were identifiable in the geophysics. And I think so out of I think we had 560 markers around there, 70 markers. We were able to identify about 295 of those in the geophysics, which means that there's a lot left that either the remains due to the acidity of the soil haven't preserved, or the geophysics just wasn't capable of detecting that. And so, yeah, let's see. So yeah, 709 stones were photographed and documented. There were about 130 footstones that were, so we just kind of deducted that from the overall headstone. But so there's 579. And let's see, yeah, so the geophysical methodologies that we performed, they identified an additional 249 unmarked graves out there. You know, thinking about Prewitt Slave Cemetery in a larger cemetery context, slave cemetery context in the Southeast, this makes this one of the largest slave cemeteries in the Southeast. Justin Donovan, who did a lot of work in Africatown down in Mobile, he did a survey of some of the slave cemetery, well, most of the slave cemeteries that are known in the Southeast. And the larger ones typically range between think it was 700, and then there's one that was newly identified in Louisiana recently that was roughly 1,000 that wasn't known. And so this makes Prewitt Slave Cemetery one of the largest known slave cemeteries in the Southeast and in the US. I think the second largest one known in Alabama, and Dr. Brown can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's a slave cemetery that's in Limestone County, and there's about 250 folks. And the Boy Scouts went out there about 25 years ago and did a survey of that. Not geophysical, obviously, but so there's likely way more buried in that cemetery. So there, in addition to doing the geophysics, we were able to pull out some of the demographics for that. And so there's just some numbers in here that are related to the different types of stones. So 56 had legible descriptions. There's 514 had no writing on them. They were just field stones placed either at the head or the foot, and sometimes you weren't able to identify if it was the head or the foot of the individual. 24 comb graves are still there, and then 41 more formal and more recent markers are present. And so of the stones, 11 were female and 14 were male, and 25 had names. And the age distribution ranges between 2-day-old individuals and 83-year-old individuals. And so you can kind of see the age distribution, average age distribution of the individuals that had stones in the cemetery. So it looks like 60 to 70 is the most frequent age individuals were interred in the cemetery. And yeah, so that's about it. There it goes.
One thing that I'd like to say before Professor summarizes. Remember my chart where I talked about John Welch Prewitt being the one who established the cemetery? And when I started this effort, I looked around for someone to kind of be like my partner, kind of help me out. And an individual who had participated in the cleanings over the years, the cleanups efforts, happened to be someone that had a lot of knowledge about the cemetery. So I have a question for you. Would it be something that you would want to do if you would be able to ask John Welch Prewitt some questions? Would that be something that would be kind of interesting for you? To say, hey, I'd like to talk to John Welch Prewitt if you could. What do you say? I see everybody smiling like, what are you talking about? I want to talk to that man about it. So, what if I said to you, I know some of John Welch Prewitt's family? Interesting, huh? Guess who's in this room today? John Welch Prewitt, great granddaughter. My partner in crime. She happens to be working with me on the cemetery, and she is John Welch Prewitt, great granddaughter, and I am the granddaughter of two of the enslaved people. How about that? We're in the future.
And before we take questions or any discussion, I just also want to highlight one other thing. So as soon as we had a great time doing this field school, it was really successful. The students had a lot of great opportunities to learn archaeological methods and geophysical techniques. But then as soon as we finished the data collection, Claiborne took the lead on this, and we worked together to put together this article just very recently published in Archaeological Prospection, Collaborative Multi-Method Geophysics at the Prewitt Slave Cemetery, Northport, Alabama, just published. And it's a special issue in Archaeological Prospection talking about, beyond identifying graves, the issues in doing cemetery work beyond just finding the graves. And so we thought this was a great venue to talk about the collaborative partnership we had for the field school this effort with the community, with the students, and just working together. So we're pretty proud of the project and pretty happy with how everything went. And we're planning to, help Patricia. She mentioned she's, putting in the crosses, put them in, but she's had some problems with dogs, taking them out. And so, we'll be back out there helping her, re-identify those locations with their GPS systems whenever needed.
And I didn't tell you, just last week I had a tree to fall onto, so I have 2 more down.
Well, let us know what we can do. But yeah, we're happy to take questions, and talk about the project, the results, the process, the partnership, anything, anybody's interested in. We have a couple of minutes.
Yes, have you been working with the, Geological Society? You reached out to them or interacted with them? Actually, no, I have not. I contacted them back last fall, and they said they had a representative that might be interested in it, and they probably want to come and sit down and talk to me about it, but they haven't done that yet. Great, let's talk. Let's chat. Now, I also just heard from a professor here. She just sent me an email yesterday. Brianna Roya, Royers. She's the professor of Black Studies and something. I don't have the title with me. But she just sent me an email saying that she would like to have her students come out and visit and maybe help out. But she was interested in having them do a visit to the cemetery. But I don't remember her department, but she is in the university. Yes.
Could you pull up the map, that, the initial one that where you were plotting the stone?
This one?
If you look in the center of that and to the right, it looks like a void. And almost circular kind of deal. Yeah.
Right in there.
And even to your left more, and it's like, there's a lot of things missing there, yet when you did the geophysics, you got graves there. When you did that. And do you have an interpretation why you might have the donut hole there? It's filled in here when you have the geophysics, but it's missing it with the stone, with the any objects.
I think that this is showing the unmarked graves, and the first image is showing only the markers.
Right. Why?
One possible, like my extended family, like if there was a big typhoid outbreak and there's a bunch of unmarked graves, and they just avoided this corner of the grave, like they're like a place to accidentally run into some kids that they just like quickly buried. I don't know about this.
One thing I sort of wondered about that, and when you came out to visit, we talked about it, how perhaps, over here might have been the original entrance to the cemetery. But we didn't have a topographic map, but this is an elevated portion and it sort of sloped down. This is sort of a.
No, wait,
What?
that, down at that end down there, that's 1, 2, and 3, and up at the top, isn't that 3 and 1, 2, and 3 up at the top? Okay, so on this side over here, you're right, on this side over here, this is the area that when the cemetery was first established, you entered the cemetery on this side. So there would be very fewer graves on this side of the cemetery than there are on the other side, because they didn't do a lot of burials in this area. And I think that was the way I interpreted what they had presented and what I was looking at.
My recollection too, going out there, that was the space and up to the north as well, that seem to be the clearest. You have the least clearing that.
And no trees, there are no trees, very few, vegetation or whatever was in this area, and I think it's because it was the traffic area and the entryway as to where most of the, traffic was occurring over the years.
Another possibility might be too, that if there was cleaning enterprises in the past, it always scares me when I hear about Boy Scout Eagle projects going to. That you could have had things that were lifted, picked up, moved around or whatever. And it's usually in the areas that are the clearest. That's kind of a warning sign. And the fact that you got the graves in that location, it's filled in once you've done the geophysics, but it was missing from the land, from the top survey. And I think that's fascinating. The other thing I wanted to ask about was that, Claiborne, when you said that you had from 2 feet to like 4 feet on the barriers.
Yeah, well, here were like from like 20 inches down to like
20
5.
inches in that circle area, or do you have that plotted?
How deep these were right here?
Yeah, where were the ones that were the shallow?
I think they were in sort of this area here because there's a lot of erosion. And I think a lot of
That's kind of the thing, because otherwise, if you put a burial in at 20 inches, you're gonna have it dug up.
yeah.
All sorts of animals would be digging that, but if you've had a lot of erosion and things picked around, you're gonna have a circle.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And the majority of these, especially up in on the backside and the top areas, they were about 75 centimeters to a meter down. So they were, within that 2 to 4 feet range, but those down there, I do remember them being shallow.
I just wanted to say that I think this is really inspiring. I think that you're really inspiring for getting this going and making such incredible progress. And I think it's inspiring that the university and there's a bridge between the community and the university. The whole entire project is incredibly inspiring. No question of it. And you have to hand it to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Professor, for your help. Thanks for making that comment, because I agree with you 100%. The coordination between the university and the community, it just makes things a whole lot better because we're both learning and it's